Anyway, I'd like you to, I'm looking for the verse, my grace is sufficient. I had a message before, and then and then Doug sung Brightly Beams, and I thought, okay, that sounds like a good one. And then he sung the next song, and I want to preach on my grace is sufficient, because as I began to think about it, I thought about the service Saturday morning, and I want to use this. What's that? I think it's second. My strength. Let's see. My grace is sufficient for thee. Okay, sufficient. Come on, look it up. Okay. All right. We're going to turn first to 2 Corinthians chapter number 5 and verse 14. Whichever teenager finds, well, I don't have any change in my pocket. I forgot I gave it. What's that? 2 Corinthians 12:9. You'll get a kiss when we go home. Okay, so that's all you get. Okay, so 2 Corinthians 12:9. No, it isn't it is 2 Corinthians 12:9 because I was in Romans 12:9. Okay, I hate glasses. I can't stand these things. All right. So leave your finger in 2 Corinthians 12. That's where we're coming from, or going to. Go now to 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 14. That's where we're coming from. Okay? So from 2 Corinthians 5:14 to 2 Corinthians 12:9. Paul writes this: "For the love of Christ constraineth us, because we thus judge, that if one died for all, then we're all dead. And that he died for all, that they which live should not henceforth live unto themselves, but unto him which died for them and rose again." Fortunately, I have that verse memorized, so I don't have to keep these glasses on. Verse 9, "And he said unto me," I want you to look at this very carefully, "My grace is sufficient for thee. For my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses." Now look at this next phrase: "For Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong." I hate glasses. Now, I read 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 14. Saturday, we went to a funeral for Vicki Whitney. Some of you know her. Some of you did not know her. Gary and Vicki, just before the election back in November, and maybe even a Sunday in October, came and just were kicking the tires, just looking at our church. And so I went in their home to get acquainted. I waited for a week or two and then called them and I said, "Can't you mind if I come by and visit?" And they said, "Sure." So I went by and spent some time with them and had an absolutely wonderful visit. And one of the things that really struck me, not only in talking to Vicki after church and talking to Gary and hearing her testimony, or Gary actually giving his testimony of how he got saved through the testimony of his wife, but then being in their home, having information I wasn't privy to when I first met them, that she had ovarian cancer, which only 3 to 5% of people ever survive. Had I not had that information, I would never have known. And when I went that night to their house, I was stunned. I'll be honest with you. The service was at another church, and there was another pastor, and he did an absolutely fabulous job with the service. I was very impressed. And you know me, I try to be very appropriate. So there were 3 people that spoke. The first was a young man who grew up in the neighborhood and looked at her as the neighborhood mom. It's good to have neighborhood moms, because neighborhood moms take care of business. They kick other kids in the neighborhood and tell them, you know, straighten up. And this kid hung out with her boys, and he told a story. She knew about the story. They were going to build a clubhouse, and they decided to utilize what they considered to be free wood in a construction area in their neighborhood. And they got in trouble with the police and all of that, and she was ticked, but he said one thing that struck him was that even as angry as she was, how compassionate she was and how she dealt with it, with not only her sons, but with him. The second lady that spoke, or the second person that spoke, was a soccer coach. Now, remember that this soccer coach had been the coach of her daughter 20 years ago and had taken her and the team to the state championship, and they won the state championship. She gave a testimony of Vicki. Vicki and Gary were they were the managers of the team. She was the coach, and she appreciated Vicki because she said that Vicki took care of all the stuff behind the scenes. She said, you know, having all these teenage girls and so forth, and being at tournaments around boys and so forth, and she was very concerned about the problems and the difficulties that young ladies could get involved with, you know, but she said Vicki was always there to supervise, and nothing happened. She was just, but what she said was this, and this really struck me. So I'm sitting there and I'm listening at this, and I'm taking it all in the service. And she says, I always admired who she was, admired her life, and just admired how happy she was, the smile, and just her demeanor, what she was. So I'm listening to all this. And then there was another lady that spoke who was one of her best friends. And she talked about where she was raised. And I enjoyed it. I didn't get to tell you, Ruby, but she grew up around San Diego. My cousins lived in San Diego. So they started talking about different things. Disneyland. I started going to Disneyland when I was a little guy. I remember one of my fondest memories in all of my life, and I still look back at it. It was like my visit to Fantasia, okay, or Treasure Island. I had a friend who thought I was his best friend, and I was a friend, okay, but I definitely wasn't his best friend. I had a lot of friends, but he considered me his very best friend, so he chose to have me go with him by myself, just us two. His parents paid for us, paid for everything. We stayed in the Disneyland Hotel, and they gave us, I was 11. I have never forgotten this. I was 11 years old. He was 11 years old. He didn't want to ride any rides at all. He was a stick in the mud, a boring kid, okay? I didn't know this until we got to Disneyland, okay? So his parents gave us money and gave us, you know, and gave us the freedom. I can't even imagine. I'm thinking about that now. We would never have done that, okay? And my mom and dad obviously didn't ask enough questions, but I'm telling you what, I lived it up for about I can't even remember, I think we went for 3 or 4 days, maybe it was almost a week. And man, I'm riding the monorail into Disneyland, and we're having a blast, and I'm riding every ride known to Dan in Disneyland, and we had access to the swimming pool, and we had access to the arcades, and so, I mean, can you imagine 11 years old playing every arcade game? I loved baseball, and they used to have that one where you had the bat that would swing and hit that ball-bearing ball up, and then hit the home run, and if you got enough runs, then you could get credits and you could keep playing. I played that for hours. Okay, don't know where he was because I ditched him. Okay, and we would, every once in a while we'd hook up, and then we'd go to a show, and then I'd ditch him again, and I'd go ride rides. I mean, it was just unbelievable. What was the point of all that anyway? Oh, listening to her, there were some pictures in the video. They had a picture of Bob's Big Boy, and if you have you ever seen those big, Bob holding up this humongous burger? Okay, that's how I grew up. I found out that she had actually worked for Shell Oil. We were Shell Oil dealers for my dad and my granddad for 10 years. After my dad got saved, that's the time my dad got saved. So it was just neat to be able to go back in my childhood, go back in life to my home turf and to think about that. But what struck me was, as a teenager, how much of an impact she had on people's lives and in her family and with her friends as a teenager. She was a cheerleader in a school of 2,000. And she was, they said, her friend, she was as out there, and by that meaning as vocal and as bold as she was today, before she died as a Christian. She was as vocal then as a teenager about her faith. She won her husband to Christ. She saw him first. It's kind of like Linda and I. I first met her in Hammond, Indiana, when my dad was candidating for the church that her dad and mom were attending. There were 3,500, we had 7,000 at that conference, actually 7,700 teenagers that came for the grand opening, the very first national youth conference. The last thing that I was interested in was being serious about any girls, okay? And so, but Linda was 15 then, and she had wedding bells. She was already signing her name before we moved to New York, signing her name, Linda 4, and she liked how it looked. So the difference in us is I was saved and she was saved, and so it didn't take me, I was already going to church, and that was part of what attracted me to her, is the fact of what I was doing in ministry. Vicki, on the converse, saw Gary. He was good looking, and they met through some mutual friends and family. And so she said, if you want to date me, you got to go to church. He said, okay. And a couple of times he didn't show up. So after a certain point, she finally called him about the third week, and she said, if you want to date me, then you're going to go to church with me, or we're done. And so he says, okay, because he was head over heels with her. Started going to church. And they started going to a Baptist church. And an evangelist came in, and before in the service, before in church, whenever the communion would come by, he would always be respectful, and he would never take communion. Vicki and her grandmother both were praying for this young man to get saved. And so they were sitting in the service, and that was the time where you didn't talk in church. Okay? In past notes, didn't talk. And so she noticed as the plate came by for communion that he took communion. She kind of looked. And I don't know if the grandmother saw as well. So she couldn't wait till the service was over, because she knew that he never took communion before. Why is he taking communion now? And so after the service, he said, I took communion because I got saved. So she was instrumental in leading her own husband to Christ and bringing him to Christ, and was very vocal. What I was going to say that struck me about Vicki was two things. First, in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse number 14, the Bible says, "The love of Christ constraineth us." So anyway, to finish, the first young man who was a kid in the neighborhood, grew up with her son, he spoke. The second lady, a soccer coach, and as I listened to him, he made a statement. He said, "She taught me about God," or "She spoke about God to me." And he says, I was okay with that. So antenna went up, or idea came up. Probably, I don't know if this young man is saved. And then the soccer coach, she stood up and she gave her testimony, talked about her respect and her admiration, and that she had never forgotten the influence of Vicki on her life, but the way she spoke. And Doug and Ruby were here. I think you would agree with me. I wasn't sure, and I still don't know, that she really knew the Lord. So then I listened to the lady speak, who talked about her faith and talked about all that. And I started to get up, and Linda go, you know, husbands, come here. No, come here. I want. It's okay. It's okay. Yeah, I'll wear them just for you, just if you just indulge me.